All right. So it looks like it's about time to start here. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on scientific communication and storytelling organized by the Department of Energy's Office of Basic Energy Sciences Early Career Network. We're all delighted to have you here today as we explore one of the most crucial skills for early career researchers, specifically the ability to communicate complex research findings effectively to both technical and non-technical audiences. Whether it's through scientific writing, presentations, books, or even videos, mastering the art of storytelling in science is essential and forms one of the major pillars of the scientific method. And today we're really fortunate to have with us three distinguished experts who will share their insights and experiences on this very important topic. And just for everyone's information, this webinar will be recorded. We urge the audience to please submit their questions down at the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can throughout the webinar. So for the sake of time, we'll get right into our first speaker, who is Professor Michael Alley, a professor of engineering communication at Penn State University. With a strong commitment to integrating effective writing and communication into academic works, Professor Alley has authored numerous articles on scientific research, as well as the excellent book, The Craft of Scientific Presentations. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Brennan. And I welcome you today. I want you to know when I was a graduate student, like many of you, I had to give my first scientific presentation. And I had no training, no seminars such as this one, nothing to even give me a hint of what direction to go. And I have to tell you, my first presentation as a scientist or engineer was just horrible. And I think it's become a passion of mine that graduate students, postdocs do not have that experience that I had. And so today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to give you my best 12 minutes of advice for giving a scientific presentation. And that advice, I'm going to be limiting to conference presentations or seminars that you might give. And so there are other purposes for which we speak, and Professor Besley will be talking about that a little bit later on. Also, just want to say that in terms of our measures for success of a research presentation, let's say at a conference, I'm going to limit it to just how much does the audience understand? That certainly makes sense. How much do they remember? Can they retell our research story at their own institution? And then certainly how much do they believe? So I'm going to assume for the moment that you've got some content that is of value to share with an audience. Where do you start? You start by analyzing your constraints. And audience is probably one of the most important constraints. But in thinking about audience, you certainly, as a scientist or engineer, want to think about who are they? Because I would say one of the big challenges that we have is that scientists and engineers face audiences that are quite different. In other words, you've got multiple audiences in the room, and they vary in two ways. And I would say these other two ways, and you can think about what these questions would be, are the other important questions to ask about audience. One is, how much do they know about your research? And that's certainly going to affect the background that you give, the terms that you define. So that I would say is important. And then I would say another thing is, and this is a question that a lot of even seasoned engineers and scientists fail to ask, why will your research interest them? And that one is so important because one of my biggest mistakes when I gave my first presentation is I tried to present everything. I was trying to impress the audience. I really wasn't thinking about the presentation from their perspective. But you have got a mountain of information that you could give the audience about your research. But this question about why is going to focus you. And so and the best presenters in science and engineering, they ask that question beforehand and they think deeply about what is it that the audience really wants to learn about their or needs to learn about their research. And in doing so, this limitation, they narrow their scope so that they do not have to hurry. So, at this point, you may be hearing saws in the background. I'm at Penn State University, and as you might imagine, it's the first week of school. And so all the construction that happens on the streets around the university, that all gears up right on this week. So just think of that saws as just people at work. Okay, so that I would say is kind of preliminaries. Let's think about then organization of those details, and then what it is that we're going to say. So when we're presenting research, we essentially tell the same story. All of us do. We in some way give our research questions. Some of you might say research hypotheses or research objectives, but we give that early on. And then that kind of sets the organization. How will the question be tested? What are the results of those tests? And then what do those tests mean? And so that's kind of the general organization. But within each of these, there's a lot of thought that has to go into your ordering of things. And a lot of people, and I included on my first one, want to start with what's the scope of the research or what the research question is. So you're looking at this image here from a talk that was discussing 5 different methods for reducing sulfur dioxide emissions from coal-fired boilers. And that's not a great place to start, because for many audiences, that statement right there doesn't have a lot of meaning. And so a lot of times when we start, we don't start with our scope or really what our research question is. We start with the motivation. It could be an example, such as you're looking at this haze in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. What causes that haze? Well, it's smog. What causes that smog? It comes from sulfur dioxide emissions of coal-fired plants that are upwind of Beijing. And then perhaps even talk about what are the, depending on the audience, what are the negative health effects of smog? What kind of life reductancy they have? The point is, you want to think about order. And when you say your scope, you say your research question, it's got to mean something to the audience. And so here I've given you one, I'd say one of my best tips is narrow your scope so you don't have to hurry. I'd say another important tip is when you're organizing details, lead with the familiar. This example, even though they may not know about Tiananmen Square and you have to tell them that story, but that particular story is much more familiar to them than a listing of these methods for reducing sulfur dioxide emissions, and its motivation for them to wrestle with the complexity that you're going to talk about later on. So I've talked about kind of a little bit thinking about before the presentation, the thinking that goes into it. We've talked a little bit about organization. I'd like to talk about visual aids. And Professor Hayes is going to be talking about, I think some informal types of visual aids, but I'm going to focus on slides that we would project at a conference. And so many people, I would say most presenters, their presentations are not as strong as they could be. And a big reason is that they use PowerPoint defaults, which came out in 1987, were not based on any research for how people learn. and they run counter to how people learn. And probably one of the biggest problems is you see this nested bullet list in the middle. That bullet list leads people to put too much text on the slide, more text than the audience can process while they are listening to you. And the number of bad examples are legion. Okay. I'm not necessarily picking just on these institutions. I could find a host of others at my institution. So the question comes, well, if you're not going to follow PowerPoint's defaults, and by the way, I don't have a problem with PowerPoint. I use that particular program. There are other programs, but I mean, I don't have a problem with the program itself. It's just the defaults. But in terms of how to, what to or how to design slides, I would say there are three important principles. And the first one is to build your talk on messages, not topics. So I'm giving you the principles of this assertion evidence approach, but I would say to you that these principles are actually the same principles that are used in TED Talks. The difference is that in a TED Talk, you're generally presenting to primarily non-technical people. That's your most important audience. Whereas in a conference presentation, your most important audience is going to be technical. There may be some non-technical people in there. You may want to address them in certain ways, but generally your most important people will actually be in your field. And so building your talk on messages, not on topics. And so you see that there, and that step alone, what it does for you as a presenter, it makes you focused. Instead of a lot of just silly stuff that people end up talking about because they're just putting a phrase headline background, for instance, in bullet list, they have really thought about, hey, here's the main takeaway of this scene. What do I need to support that? And you want to think about, in a sense, this message, thinking about your talk in messages. The best presenters think that way. What's the main takeaway you want the audience to leave the room with? And then what are supporting messages that will get the audience to that place in that for them to think? So that's probably the hardest part for you. The next part, actually, you'll probably be pretty good at, being younger, is support your message with visual evidence. And so that could be photographs, that could be drawings, that could be diagrams, that could be graphs, that could be films, that could be small tables, it could be combinations of these. And then once you've done that, I mean, you've kind of got a set of slides. How do you deliver those slides? And principle number 3 is explain the visuals by fashioning sentences on the spot. So if you notice, I don't have any bullet list, okay? You don't need bullet lists. Bullet lists end up in a conference, end up being your notes. This is your work. If you've got the images, if you've got your experimental setup, and then you've got your results, and you've got graphs, you don't need those bullet lists. And so then that allows you to turn to the audience. And so the speaker here, and this is a speaker on my title slide, is Cheryl Hayashi. And she gave one of the best TED Talks I've seen. It's probably one of the most technical TED Talks I've seen. You can, if you want to watch her TED Talk, just type in TED, T-E-D, and then spiders, and then hers will come up. But take a look at that. I mean, watch that talk, but pay a lot of attention. Minutes 6 through 9, 6 through 10, she presents a couple of graphs, just a tour de force on how to present graphs. And so, with that, I think this is a good time to stop here. And I would just kind of conclude by saying that I've got a website, a free resource for you to kind of learn more about just presentations in general and this approach in particular. And that even includes actual free workshops for grad students and young researchers on making making presentations, www.assertionevidence.org. And so with that, I am going to turn things back here to Brennan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely talk. In the interest of time, I think we'll skip the questions for now and go to our next speaker, who is Professor Sophia Hayes, the Vice Dean of Graduate Education and a Professor of Chemistry at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Hayes' research delves into the structure and properties of inorganic systems with a focus on semiconductors and materials with optical and electronic properties. Professor Hayes is also a passionate advocate for science communication, having testified before Congress on the helium crisis and having delivered a TEDx talk on climate change. So we'll have you take it away, Professor.
Thank you so much. And I really wanted to thank the organizing students, Michael and Brennan and Lindsay, for doing such a great, or Lauren, excuse me, for doing such a great job getting this together. And I love talking about science communication because I've had some terrific lessons over the years. And so I'll just dive right in. And I think I'm going to be able to highlight a number of areas in common with Professor Alley. So let me start by the following. One of the great analogies I've heard about scientific communication and storytelling in general is that it's like a string of pearls. You start with a hook. You then move on through different pearls or nuggets of knowledge as you go through your story, and then you bring it back at the end to pull the whole thing together. And so using that analogy, let's think about that in the context of storytelling and just a couple of tips and tricks that come from this kind of training. So as I'm not advancing for some reason, let me try. No, I'm frozen. Let me try. There we go. So thanks for the highlight that, yes, I was honored to give a TEDx talk back in 2019, something I'd pitched as far back as 2016. And I'm going to violate one of the core TED principles, which is to have one big idea. And I'm going to give you two big ideas for scientific communication, or maybe let's call it two tools for your toolbox. And they're as follows. So the first thing that I'm going to tell you about is start your story in the middle. And this is going to highlight some things that Professor Alley told us about, but let me get you to think about it in terms of an exercise. And that means crafting that great hook, that great start to that pearl necklace that we talked about a moment ago. And then the second tip or trick is that every graph tells a story. And so this highlights, again, something that he alluded to in his talk about how we scientists present data and how we can make it more clear to audiences of all sorts, whether it's the general public or, again, to more advanced audiences of our own colleagues as we move through material. So, and I keep losing my pointer for some reason. So the first one is, let's talk about what it means to start your story in the middle. What do I mean by that? So here, one thing that I'll say is that as scientists, we tend to speak chronologically. We set up our papers with introductions and experimental plans, results, then discussion, and then conclusions. And we have a tendency to think that way. Notice that if I wanted to tell you my life story, I might say, well, I was born here and I went over here to school and then I was trained further and had professional careers. We have that chronological tendency, and we need to break ourselves of that habit, because actually that tends to lose audience attention. So if we think about this in terms of a goal, the goal is really you want to keep an audience interested, of course. You want to hold their attention, but you want to make people care to hear more. And that's something that TED Talks really emphasizes. How do you get people to care? You also see this in journalistic examples of communication. When newspaper stories are written, they often start with a case study. So how can we bring that into our scientific talks? Well, so I'll give you an example or two, but I'll also say, first of all, it takes practice. We don't just come to this naturally. And so often it helps to engage a partner to listen to you. In my process, I had 7 months of training with individual coaches that were assigned to me, as well as an entire team that would further refine the talk every time I gave it, again and again and again. Now, most of us can't do that for big presentations when we're going out to conferences, but find a partner who can listen to you. And what you want to think of is, what was a major finding that you had in this work? What was a breakthrough moment in that research? Or can you highlight something you or your group members overcame in order to make that talk happen, to make that the subject of your talk happen? And I'll illustrate this with an example. But if you tell your story to just like a partner that you might talk through, that listener will probably land on something that just can serve as that hook, that starting point for the talk from which everything else can be derived. And so what do I mean? So let me sort of give you one of those hooks that I might use for some work. So this being a DOE audience, let me try one from the area of direct air capture. So I would say, I'd start out my talk by saying, grad students are amazing scientists, and they come completely new to a project. They might be lightly trained, they'll have new perspectives, and they just may bring a completely different viewpoint because they're entering something that I might have worked on for a decade or more, but they're seeing for the first time. So I'm going to tell you in this talk today about a grad student who ran an experiment that I would have wholeheartedly counseled against. It was misguided, it was naive, and frankly expensive to run. In other words, I would have said it was a waste of time. But in the story I'm about to tell you in this talk today, she showed me that sometimes old problems need a new set of eyes. So that's my hook. What it was about is about something that I'm showing here on the screen. The actual paper that came out of that was that a bicarbonate signal was detected that had been missed for years. But by leading into this whole paper that I would then talk about in, let's say, a more standard format that Professor Alley referred to in his talk about that structure that we could bring to this presentation. But this initial hook might get people in the audience to sit up and listen a little bit more, in part because it's a human story about this student who actually made a really thoughtful discovery. And again, I can be slightly humorous in the telling of it and maybe slightly self-deprecating by saying, gosh, here's something that we almost missed. And there are many such stories in science, but your audience of all types, a highly technical one, or even the general public, might find this story a little bit more compelling just by leading in with some sort of anecdote of this type. So this is just one example, and there are many. And again, this comes through active practice, through many, many, trials and errors. So definitely, I started with the middle of the story here. And it was a great hook because it was a story about how the discovery was made. So that's tip number one. Tip number two is a useful formula that I got early on in my training, and it's the idea that every graph tells a story. And I want to acknowledge that a physicist taught me this, and this is Professor Mark Conradi, who was a great communicator of science. So let me tell you about that. First of all, in talks, we are inundated with data, and it comes at us very quickly in a 10-minute, 15-minute, 20-minute, sometimes longer talk, and there's not a lot of time to take in that data that for me is very familiar, but for you as an audience, you're seeing for the first time. So the good news is we have an algorithm for that. And this being a scientific audience, hopefully this will land well. So there's 4 steps. And if you do this, this lands well every time with every audience I ever give a speech in front of. And it's just in 4 parts. Number 1, here are the data from, and fill in the blank. Take time to describe the x-axis. Take time to say what the units are and and not yet interpret them. Take time to describe the y-axis. Read it, tell what the units are, and then finally tell the story. What do the data tell us? And I'll show this through, again, another example. So first of all, here's just some data from the New York Times. It turns out it's the change in Greenland ice sheet mass. You may or may not be able to read this on the screen if you're in a large lecture hall. So again, how we can tell the story of this graph is in those 4 parts. So here's number 1. Here's a graph of the loss of mass of the Greenland ice sheet over time. Here's number 2 and 3. Along the x-axis is time in years, shown from 2002 to 2017. Number 3, the y-axis has a negative scale, starting from here and moving downwards in billions of metric tons of ice. These numbers are negative because they start from 0 in 2002, and then they decrease with time. Then 4 is the longer story. I don't necessarily need to read this. I know that this will be up in the recorded webinar, but just briefly, I talk briefly what the data show. I might say a phrase like, what's important here? And note the ice sheet decreases slowly at first, and then there's more mass loss, and we need more data to be certain. So the point about this is, having taken that pause and then telling the story about the data gives people time to take it in because, again, they'll be seeing it for the first time in these scientific presentations. So once again, back to that string of pearls. If you have a really great hook, you walk people through pearl to pearl of knowledge, and then you bring it back at the end, you can create that pearl necklace that really helps us make good storytelling and really good science presentations. And so what I've done here again is to tell you to start that story in the middle, crafting that start that will get audiences engaged. And then remember that every graph tells a story. And with that, thank you. That's all I've got.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely talk. I think we probably have time for a question or two before we start the next one. There is one question in the Q&A which asks, should we describe every graph that we put in our presentation?
Yeah. So I personally, just from my perspective, would say yes, in part because if you think about it just for a moment, what's the purpose of the graph in your presentation? And so, again, maybe every graph would get onerous after a while. So just making sure that the narrative follows, and just if you want, practice in front of somebody who's never seen the talk before, even if they're not from your field. Did they take away the messages that you want them to know? And so I've found that to be really helpful. But I get what you're saying. That could become, I'm a spectroscopist, so if I described every spectrum in that level of detail, it might become a little challenging. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, and just to maybe a little follow-up to that, it seems like perhaps once you've described one graph and told the story of one graph, it's easier then later on for the audience to understand the next graph if it's of the same type. So maybe that also applies as well.
Fair enough. It just depends on how diverse your materials are. So I'm simply saying that many of us do not take the moment to describe the two axes. That's really the only piece that's really new. And if things are going quickly, and again, sometimes it's not legible. If you take just that moment, it's a few seconds out of the talk, but it really makes a difference in whether the material gets absorbed and leaves with the audience. And really, that's what we all want, isn't it? We want people to leave with those messages that are embedded in what we're trying to present.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. It looks like we have a lot of questions coming in, so there's going to be a lovely discussion at the end here. But for now, I think let's move on to our next speaker. So our final speaker is Professor John C. Bestley, the Ellis N. Brandt Professor of Public Relations at Michigan State University. Professor Bestley's work focuses on enhancing the effectiveness of science communicators through evidence-based strategies. He has an extensive publication record and has been a lead author for the National Science Board's chapters on public attitudes and knowledge about science and technology. So welcome, Professor Bestley.
Thanks guys for inviting me, and I really enjoyed both those previous talks, and I'm looking forward to have a broader conversation. So I'll keep this as tight as possible, and I think I have one core thing that I really want to emphasize. A lot of the bigger picture will come out of this picture of my colleague Anthony Duno and I in front of a book we published a couple of years ago. One of the things Anthony and I do together is we do a lot of research, and so a lot of what I'm going to say comes out of, I'm a social scientist, comes out of the research that we're doing, whether that's lots of interviews, lots of surveys. We do interviews with lots of different types of people, individual scientists, scientific organizations, foundations. We're sort of in a lucky position where we have an opportunity to really try to understand what's happening in the scientific community when it comes to communicating in the context of science. So my perspective is going to be a little bit different in that I think it builds on that it's really important to give a great talk. It's not always easy to do as well, and it's also really, when you're part of giving a great talk is doing it in a sort of a narrative style that can really help. I'm going to argue though that the first thing that the scientist needs to ask themselves so it shouldn't be. Often when I get into this is, well, how can I be more clear? How can I be more interesting? How can I tell a better story? How can I correct misinformation? Those are great questions, but they're not the first questions I want people to think about. Closer is, how can I get people to think and feel something? That's not bad. But what I'm going to argue is what you really want to think about anytime you're communicating, whether it's a talk, whether it's talk to a group of fellow scientists, whether it's a talk in a broader to policymakers or to a community group, whatever it is. the fundamental thing that you need to be thinking about is, what do you want to happen in the real world? What do you want people to do? And that think and feel bit, we'll come back onto it a little bit. My book's mostly about the think and feel bit. But today I really want to emphasize why I think it's really important to focus on what people think and do. And so the way that I think about that is I separate it into three buckets. There's the behaviors, there's the things that make the behaviors more likely. So the audience specific behavioral goals, the things that make those behaviors more likely, which I like to say beliefs, feelings, frames. People don't like beliefs, they think like belief in God, but I mean belief that that's a risk, or belief that that's a benefit, or belief that that person is trustworthy. Feelings, which is to say discrete emotions, and framing, which it's a little bit more of a complicated thing, but like, do you see it as a gain or a loss kind of things? But those are the things we can actually affect directly through communication. Now, communication, we got lots of choices. Communication's where all the fun, creative stuff comes in. When we do longer trainings, we really get into like matching your tactics to your objectives, to your goals. But I really want to emphasize, I want to play a little bit in this goal space, because I found in the last couple of years that this goal space turns out to be really, really tricky. And so on one hand, so one of the most common things I hear is when I say, what's your goal to a scientist? They say, I want to correct misinformation. And my job is to say, well, why do you want to correct misinformation? What do you think would happen if you corrected misinformation? What do you think would change in them? What would somebody do differently? Or somebody will say, I want to increase science literacy. I'm working with some astrophysicists, so they might say, I want to increase awe and wonder. And again, my job is to say, well, what do you want to happen? Is it that you think, if you increased awe and wonder, if you corrected that misinformation, what do you think would happen? If we push people, what we find is we generally get two buckets of things. There's one, I want somebody to do something. I want a kid to consider a science career. I want a policymaker to consider a piece of scientific evidence when they're making some new rule or regulation. In a public presentation, I want people to cite my research, and even citing sort of like the visual thing of it, but like, I want people to use my research. I think I found something really cool, and I want people to use what I found in their research and build on it. So there's a behavior there, right? So it's what I want people to hire me. I want people to, whatever it is. The key is that there's something that you want somebody to do. There's a bit of a tricky one, which is some of those behaviors are what we would call a trust-related behavior. When we say trust, it's sort of, this is a word we throw around. But sometimes I want people to take my advice. When you take somebody's advice, you make yourself vulnerable to them. And so there's this element of sometimes when I'm talking with scientists, they don't have a thing they want to happen right now, but more broadly, they want over time to people to turn to them for advice, which is to say, they want people to trust them as a behavior, like this behavioral trust. So there's those. So when I'm thinking of goals, I really do mean people doing something. There's a really tricky one, another set of really tricky ones, which almost never hear people sort of volunteer unless they've been doing it for a long time, which is one of the goals you can and should have when you give talks, when you do any sort of communication, is thinking about, what do I want to change to myself, right? So what is listening? Like real listening. What is real listening? Real listening means communicating in a way that you hear something, you change your beliefs and feelings, and you do something differently. And so like in a talk, when I was just helping a student prepare a talk, and I was asking her, like, is there something in your research where you'd like advice? Is there a place here where I mean, that's the core. Would you like advice? I'm working with some ecologists, and like, are there communities of people, foresters, whatever, who might have some insights that could help you make better research choices? If that's a goal of your talk, which it often should be for lots of good ethical reasons, then we need to design our communication so that we have the opportunity to take in information, not just share information. And the broad version of that, the trust version of that, is sometimes we're trying to figure out who we can work with, right? And so we're trying to figure out who we can be vulnerable to. But the core is this idea of, when I think of goals, I really mean we got to think about behaviors. And because only when we think about what is it that I want to happen, can I figure out what do I need to be clear about? What should I tell stories about? And now this is really tricky, right? So some of the challenges of thinking about goals is that when we think about our goals, like, so my goal in general, when I give talks with my research, is I want people to turn to science when, my vision, I suppose, is that people turn to science when faced with challenging things. For that to happen, more practically, my goals are, I need scientists to communicate more effectively. And for that to happen, we can sort of go down this thing. And so on this slide, I have an example of like, so yeah, our goal, big goal, one of our big goals might be that we want people to provide robust funding for science. Well, if we start strategizing, we have to think, well, what individual level behavior? So that's Congress. Congress people need to vote for a thing, or for that to happen, what else needs to happen? And so we have to start thinking about the sort of that hierarchy of goals. And like, so if I want people to give me a job, they need to, maybe some people need to cite my research. So how do I get people to cite my research? It's that sort of like strategic thinking and thinking through all the potential sort of levers that you could pull and building out sort of essentially individual strategies for each of those goals. Another really tricky thing I find when we're talking about scientists, and so if some of you I'm sure are doing more applied science and some of you are doing more basic science, but often when I'm dealing with basic scientists, they're like, well, I don't have a thing that I want people to do. And so they might have goals that are like, in general, I want people to turn to science. A more applied research, like I need this group of people to consider my research when they design X. And so that you can, and so I need this group of people to turn to me versus I need society to turn to science. And so we can think about, it's perfectly reasonable if you're sort of in that more applied space that your goals might be a little bit broader. Makes it trickier a little bit in the sense that maybe it's not as satisfying as this beautiful ragu here versus like the plain pasta, but it's still a thing that sometimes we have to think about is how general are our goals. It's tricky. Yeah, like I said, applied scientists, this seems a little bit difficult for. And then the other big thing I think is so this is applies less to sure, let's take that part. Oh, sorry, that I've messed up my my timing. I don't know if I can take it off. That yellow thing's only supposed to pop up afterwards. But I'll just say it. So in general, so one of the really tricky things is we're trying to, there's lots of things we could pursue. Lots of goals we could have. The trick, I think, is figuring out which ones make sense for you. And that's going to be some combination of what do you want to achieve as an individual? If you're part of an organization, what does your organization want to achieve? What assets do you have? Maybe you have access to a regular talk. Maybe you have access to a specific group of people. I'm working again with some astronomers. They have access to this great sort of community telescope. So that's an asset. And so like, well, how can I use that asset? Yeah, and so that's thinking about trying to figure out, you can't do everything, so prioritizing is really important. But the caution bit, which sort of popped up over top of this, is just this idea that I just want to hit this point again, that if you say like, what's your goal? And you come like, I want to increase awareness, what I hope you have in your life is somebody who says, well, why do you want to increase awareness? If you say like, I want to correct misinformation or improve attitudes, but there's somebody there who can help you say, well, why do you want to do that? Similarly, like I want to create dialogue. Great. Why do you want to have dialogue? I hope somebody is there to tell you, if you just say like, I want people to do this and like to push you to like, well, what do you want to change in yourself as a result of your communication? My sense is that if you can figure out what you want to achieve, it's a lot easier to start thinking about what stories to tell. It's a lot easier to think about what do I need to make sure that I'm clear on. It's a lot easier to think about, well, given my goals, how can I get people, what's interesting to other people? And so from my sense, it's just that one of the things we need to do is we just need to it's hard. We need to push ourselves to always think, why am I doing this? What's the purpose of this talk I'm giving? We need to ask for help. It was mentioned like having most of us don't have access to wonderful resources of people who can watch us for months and help us hone our talks, but most of us have access to somebody who can help us, will talk to us about our talks and what we're hoping to achieve from the time and energy we put into communication. I just have this last one here because I remember I said we need to have goals for ourselves. You know, as you're communicating, I hope you'll be working, maybe think about interacting with social scientists and communicators and saying, I need more advice on X. And if we don't have that advice, I hope you'll push us to give you advice. And I'll stop there and I look forward to the conversation. I have a website, the book's obviously out there and available, and I'm just looking forward to chatting about this. Thanks.
Excellent talk. Thank you so much. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of questions, and I'll hand it over to Lauren to start asking and handling some of those, and we'll hopefully learn a lot.
Yes, thank you, Brennan. So we, like you said, we have a lot of questions and we have 21 minutes for Q&A, so hopefully we can get to a lot of those questions. So I'm going to ask some speaker specific questions first, and then we'll close out with some more general ones. So the first one for Professor Ali is, what strategies do you have to ensure that your message is clearly understood to a more multidisciplinary audience? I know that you talked about identifying your audience and then tailoring the presentation to them. So what advice do you have for maybe more general audience?
Well, what I would say is really the advice that Professor Hayes gave, and that is the first time you give the presentation, be it at a conference or a seminar, that shouldn't be the first time that you've actually practiced the presentation in front of an audience. You need to practice in front of an audience that is as close to that presentation that you're going to be experienced as possible. And then then it's just listening to the tips. You know, Professor Besley talked about the importance of listening. You really got to be a good listener when after you've presented, and then it's not necessarily that it's the advice that they give you, but it's the things that they say about your talk and the things that they don't say about your talk in terms of what were things that you thought were important that apparently didn't get across. So that would be my best tip.
Great, thank you. So now we'll move to a question for Dr. Hayes. How do you handle audience questions, and especially when there's no graph or like slide that goes in response to that?
Yeah, so I would just say that there are two things. Audience questions, you always want to be honest, of course. So if I don't have anything to back up something that I might claim, I always offer to get back to the speaker in a separate conversation later. And then I'm somebody who often has backup graphics because I have that luxury to do so in case I anticipate a question. Even, esoteric graphics that nobody would think would be useful in the context of a technical talk. So having backup slides, and then also being willing to communicate after the presentation is always two ways to do that.
Wonderful, thank you. And then for Dr. Besley, one question that came from the audience during your talk was, do classic examples of stories, they gave the example of Homer's Odyssey, have behavioral objectives, and can technical stories adopt some of those objectives?
So I would say they, as far as I know, they don't have. So one of the things, like, journalists often don't have objectives. Now, this is the difference between strategic communication and sort of a great story. A great story doesn't have to have a goal, right? And so now it doesn't mean it's not going to have effects. It's going to still have effects. The idea as a strategic communicator is to think about, I only got so much time or space with this communication. How do I make it worth my while? And if your goal, so a great story it might just be the purpose is to entertain people. I suppose in the modern day, the goals of the authors, they want to sell books too. But it's more about how do you use stories to achieve goals rather than classical story structures. And so I guess I'll point it. So one of the cool things about the hero's journey, for example, structure, is if one of our goals is building trust. One of the things that the hero's journey lets you do is put the focus on a character, the character of the scientist. So what builds trust? Well, what we know from research is that if you want somebody to trust you, they need to believe that you're caring, competent, and honest, right? Probably willing to listen to. But stories are a way that you can talk about what you did to listen, what your motives are, how you protect your integrity. And so those can be a little bit of a weird thing to try to just sort of stick into a talk. But if you're telling a story, you can demonstrate those trustworthiness factors in the context of a story, because the story has a scientist as a character.
Thank you. We'll cycle back through. We're getting through these questions pretty quickly. So Professor Ali, how much can you simplify your messages without compromising, say, some of the details of the science within and the exactness of the science exactly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, and that goes, I think the heart of it was what Einstein said in scientific writing: keep things as simple as possible, yet no simpler. And the yet no simpler is such an important an important part. And so I would say a lot of it comes down to depth that you are able to give in the talk. And at the beginning of the talk, do not hesitate to state your limitations, because you don't want to just talk really fast. That's going to reduce how much people are going to be able to understand. So you've got to limit things, and it's perfectly fair to say, given the time constraints of this talk today, then then to move forward. Now, in a paper, you sometimes have length restrictions, so that's kind of the same thing, but you can give references. You can give references in a talk to other people, and standing on their shoulders is a win for you. I didn't realize that when I was a younger scientist, but you build credibility by knowing who in the field does good work and by citing them. And also, if they happen to be in the audience, you kind of win them over on your side, which is kind of nice. That's what I would say to that one.
I'd love to add. So one of the things, so being accurate is of course sort of you just have to be accurate. It's not really a choice. But sometimes there's a danger that we spend so much time focused on how can I make sure that I'm entirely accurate. Of course, you have to be entirely accurate versus what am I trying to achieve? And the depth that you go into is a function of your goals and the context in which you're doing it. So it may be that in the context of a 10-minute talk, you can't have a goal that I'm going to teach everything about X. And so you have to be like, well, what given what my constraints, given the assets I have, the resource, the space that I'm in, what is a reasonable goal for me? And so, no, yeah, it's just, we get distracted by this. The goal of science, so the obnoxious thing I've been saying lately is science communication isn't about communicating science. It's communicating in the context of your science, right? And it's about which is about your goals. And the science education might be, I'm going to teach you about science, but that's not, if we're going to differentiate from science education, science communication from education, they're a bit different.
Yes, thank you. I think that's one of the major things that a lot of presentations get into, is going through too much stuff and getting too bogged down in the details. But thank you for your advice. I have a general question from the audience, and I can start with Dr. Hayes on this one, but do you have any advice for a nervous speaker and how they can overcome their nerves?
Yeah, that is one of those things. You know, they say public speaking is one of the greatest fears that most people have, along with heights and spiders or something. Anyway, so with that being the case, I think practice is, of course, important. I will say that I was a student who studied in Germany for a while and had to give some talks in German, and that was really fearful for everybody involved, including the audience. So I would simply say it's really about practicing and slowing down. I think and articulating very well, enunciating. So that articulation and enunciation and practicing many times in the foreign language or can be really, really helpful. And then always, work with an audience of friends or, peers, whatever it could be. And that always helps calm the nerves. So perhaps there are others who have good tips about that.
I have a couple of things to say. I would say, number one, think positively before the presentation. Just imagine yourself just like a tennis player imagines hitting a shot at a certain spot. You imagine saying things and heads nodding. Arrive early. I can't tell you how many times, including today, that just helps overcome nuances in how presentations equipment is put together. And then third, I think about what Twain said to a nervous presenter backstage. He said, don't worry, they're not expecting much. I don't know, that kind of fires me up on stuff. I'd say one last thing, and this kind of goes to something that Professor Hayes said. It's not really about you. It's about your work. And the audience wants you to succeed. They want to understand what it is you've done. And I think that kind of doing it for all the sweat you put into this work, doing it for the work is just a good state of mind to be in.
Wonderful. And then I have a question for Professor Besley. As graduate students, we often get pushed by advisors to include more and try stuff as much as we can, like put as much stuff into the talk as we can. How do we convince advisors and those that are, say, senior to us, that we need to narrow the scope to tell a better story?
That's a great question. And I immediately start thinking about, all right, so my goal is to get my advisor to let me do less. So then I'm like, well, if I want my advice, that's a behavior. And so like, if I want that to happen, they need to see the benefits of doing less. They need to see that there's a risk of doing too much. They need to see that the social norms aren't to do too much, and that they need to believe that I have the ability to do it well. And so I start thinking about, that's its own little campaign. It's its own little sort of, and so what is there except making the argument? And the argument is like, and in a respectful way, in a way that's, yeah, I mean, it's that's a little campaign on its own. And then, again, I think going back to the thing that I think both folks have said, that you're not going to always get to do the exact presentation you like. They're still your boss. They may still be your boss, and you make the best of the opportunity you have. And hopefully you have an advisor that you can play it, you can go back and forth with. So if you have an advisor that's so stuck in their ways, that's really tricky. That's going to be a longer term thing. But hopefully you have a relationship where you can play. Maybe you can make multiple versions that say, what about this? What about that? This is, of course, a general thing of like reviewer number 3. Everybody always wants more. Like, well, why didn't you do this? Like, you can't always do more. And so it's just you gotta be willing to push for what you think makes sense, while also being willing to listen to like somebody else's arguments, including the advisor who knows lots of stuff, probably might have some insights too.
Great, thank you. This question could be a general one that maybe every speaker can comment on, but what do you think when you're listening to presentations by early career scientists, what are some of those very common pitfalls that you see them getting into in those presentations, and maybe some tips as to how they could overcome those?
I can start just briefly and say very quickly, I see this a lot because they're coming up for tenure, at least in my world and maybe in other places. Here's a few things we do in our lab, and then they cram everything into the talk. No, there's very little content in terms of here's something you can take away, but more like I'm going to try to impress you with just the sheer volume of work, as opposed to let's take a deep dive and let me teach you about this one really exciting finding.
I would say, think about who your models are. There are, in fiction writing and probably journalism, there are kind of recognized models of people who are, oh, this person's a good presenter, this person's a good writer. I think in science and engineering, less so, but be a critical thinker. Think about, boy, who was the best presenter at this conference in terms of how much I learned, how much I understood, how much I believed, how much I'd like to go hear this person speak again. And then let that person be your model.
Yeah, so I guess the most common thing I see is people thinking that I wrote a paper that had an introduction literature review methods, results, discussion. Therefore, my talk must follow that format. It does not need to, and sort of, I guess almost like it's good to follow social norms sometimes, but the social norms for talks are not great. And so just because everybody else did it that way does not mean you have to do it that way. Now, sometimes people go too far the other way, and they make it into a poem or something, which may have its place. But there's somewhere happy medium there where you're reflecting what's sort of expected of you, but also playing with it a bit and being confident to figure out what makes sense for you in that context, given your research. And so, yeah, it's just doing what you think what's expected of you and what everybody else did, rather than what makes sense for your context.
Great. I think that's some really useful advice, for sure for me as an early career scientist. Also another general question, when we're receiving feedback on our presentation, say before the talk or even following the talk, what's the best way to deal with conflicting suggestions and to kind of take that advice and suggestions and kind of further your presentation in a positive way?
It's trust. I mean, it's just something you have to trust yourself, right? Like there's a, I mean, you can't trust yourself entirely. We all make mistakes. And so you have to be reflexive and thoughtful about, like, am I not changing it because I'm too lazy to change it? Or am I not changing it because I have a really good reason? But this is the joy of science, right? We're charged with making judgments and using data to make judgments in some degree of uncertainty. And so I just think you gotta figure out what you're trying to achieve, and then make sure you can justify it to other people. Like, here's why I'm making this choice and not that choice. So you're being intentional. And then you do your best.
You know, one thing I would think about, and a little bit different from what Professor Besley said, just a different approach, is think about the source of the criticism. Sometimes people, they're on the spot, they're trying to give you the best critique they can, but then they're not able to articulate really what the problem is. And so just because they say do A, doesn't necessarily mean A is the best course of action. I would say a second thing, this one's a little bit sadder, it's a little bit political. Sometimes, particularly when you have professors in a room, you'll have one professor who will say one thing and another professor will say another thing just to counter the professor who said the one thing. Just be aware of those kinds of underlying conflicts, and then think about, as Professor Besley said, what's going to be best for this talk.
Yes, so I'm trying to get to your question, Dr. Hayes. Let's see. Oh yes, when you say starting the middle of the story in the middle, does it mean you don't need to talk about big motivations, or what's your suggestion on that middle of the story kind of approach?
Yeah, thank you. Because I saw several comments. I've tried to respond in writing to several, but let me just say that this is just a framework. It could be, yes, you're going to use the motivation for the research. Let's say you're in a general audience with many different topics, crossing many scientific boundaries. At times, if I hear the motivation is we want this great new and, plug in your own word, let's just say electrochemical cell. And I may or may not pay as close attention because I've heard many battery talks and that may not be my area. And so, again, I loved what Professor Besley said about, this idea of the goal. So in my case of the storytelling, I told a more human story about a grad student discovering something. And by bringing in that human element for me in the talk that I was presenting, it got people who may not be interested in direct air capture entirely to listen, because they want to hear the story of, well, how did that happen? Or what was that all about? And so I'm being sneaky. I'm coding my, my middle is that I'm coding my overall scientific talk with something that's a little bit unexpected and then might capture attention. So motivation is always a good thing. There's going to be audiences that are really goal-oriented and really wanting to hear at the Electrochemical Society meeting all about your new electrochemical cell. But just knowing that sometimes there could be this other route to engage more, diffuse audiences. And so the middle is just a way to get you to think a little bit differently about how you might bring people into the talk. So thanks, Lauren.
My version of starting in the middle is I usually like, the problem I'm trying to solve is this, right? So I don't give the whole why I'm trying to solve that problem, but it's like, what's the thing and then I can talk about, well, why is that whose problem? Like, to me, I think that's how I had thought of it as starting in the middle, but I think it's kind of the same, in the same sort of space.
Wonderful. We've reached the hour, so I want to thank all three speakers, Professor Alley, Professor Hayes, and Professor Besley. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your expertise and your advice. And I want to thank all of the audience as well as the Department of Energy Basic Energy Science Early Career Network for helping us get this organized. Thank you, everyone. And with that, we will conclude this webinar. Thank you.